You are drifting now, suspended in the quiet of a time long past. The year is 1098. We are in what is now Germany, in a world where the vast majority of people live and die without ever straying more than a few miles from the place they were born. Their lives are short, often brutal, and entirely defined by the soil they till and the Lord they serve. Education is a privilege reserved almost exclusively for the clergy. Science as we know it is a whisper, a nascent flicker in the monasteries where monks meticulously copy ancient texts. The air is thick with the unquestioned authority of the Catholic Church, its rituals and beliefs the bedrock of all existence, and its saints and demons as real as the trees in the forest. It is into this world that a 10th child, a girl named Hildegard, is born to a minor noble family, the family of Hildebert and Mechthild of Bermersheim. The family's lands are small, their title modest, but they are a branch of the wider nobility of the region. They are not powerful, but they have standing, and with that standing comes a certain obligation. From her earliest days, a strange and remarkable thing is happening to young Hildegard. She is seeing visions. These are not the whimsical daydreams of a child, they are profound, detailed, and utterly terrifying. She sees flashes of light, colors, and patterns that seem to contain an almost overwhelming spiritual significance. These visions are not fleeting. They are a constant companion, a presence that she cannot escape, and they bring with them a feeling of overwhelming, even crippling, weakness. Hildegard keeps her visions a secret. She is a child, and she knows that to speak of such things could lead to her being seen as mad, or worse, as possessed. Even within her own family, she is an unusual child. She is often sickly, plagued by what she later described as a divine light that would cause her body to seize up in pain. These episodes are so severe that they would leave her bedridden for days. It's hard for a modern mind to grasp what this must have felt like. Imagine a constant, low-grade fever that would, at random intervals, flare into a blinding, painful light that would leave you unable to move or speak. This was Hildegard's reality. At the age of 8, her parents make a decision that is common for children of noble birth, especially those who are not their firstborn sons. They present her to the church as a tithe, a living offering to God. Hildegard is sent to the Benedictine monastery at Dissebodenberg, a community of monks and a smaller, cloistered group of nuns. Here, she is placed under the tutelage of a woman named Jutta of Sponheim, a wealthy and pious noblewoman who has also chosen the monastic life. Jutta becomes Hildegard's mentor, a spiritual guide, and a surrogate mother. She teaches Hildegard to read and write, to chant the Psalms, and to live a life of prayer and asceticism. The enclosure at Dissebodenberg is stark. The cells are cold and small, the food simple. The daily routine is a rigid cycle of prayer, work, and silence. For a child, it would be a jarring and lonely existence. But for Hildegard, it is also a place of solace. The routine and the solitude provide a framework for her life, a way to manage the chaos of her inner world. Her visions continue, but she learns to live with them, to interpret them in the language of her new life, the language of scripture and religious devotion. Jutta, it seems, is the only person who understands the depths of Hildegard's spiritual experiences. Jutta too has visions, and a profound inner life, and she is able to guide Hildegard in a way that no one else could. As the years pass, Hildegard's reputation grows, though she remains in the quiet anonymity of the cloister. The nuns she lives with respect her piety and her wisdom. She is a quiet and unassuming figure, but there is a depth to her that others sense. Jutta, her mentor, becomes abbess of their small community of women, and Hildegard, in turn, becomes her closest confidant. They are a remarkable pair, these two women, bound by their shared spiritual journeys and their commitment to a life of service. In 1136, Jutta of Sponheim dies. The community of women, now grown to a significant size, must choose a new leader. Without hesitation, they choose Hildegard. She is now 38 years old, and she is at a crossroads. The spiritual visions that have been a part of her life since childhood are becoming more frequent and more powerful. They are no longer just flashes of light. They are coherent messages, visions of the divine order of the universe, of the relationship between God and humanity. She feels a growing pressure to record them, to share them with the world. but she is also crippled by a profound sense of fear and inadequacy. Who is she, a humble and often sickly nun, to speak for God? This period of indecision and fear is one of the most significant in her life. She is a woman who, until now, has lived her entire life in the quiet safety of a monastery. The world outside its walls is a world of kings and popes, of wars and political intrigue. To step out of the shadows and speak, to claim a direct line to the divine, is a monumental act of courage. It is also an act that could lead to her being branded a heretic, a dangerous figure to be silenced or worse. The choice before her is not just about her own future, it is about the future of her community, and it is a choice that will, in time, shape the course of European history. Her visions, which have been a source of both pain and inspiration, now demand to be shared. But how can she, a woman in a male-dominated world, convince anyone to listen? Hildegard's internal struggle is a long and agonizing one. For years after Juta's death, she remains silent, crippled by a sense of humility and a deep fear of what would happen if she were to reveal her divine visions. She is a woman in a world where women are meant to be silent, to be passive, to be defined by their roles as wives, mothers, or nuns. To speak with the authority of God is a radical, almost unheard of act. She begins to suffer from a profound physical illness, a divine light that she later describes as causing her entire body to shake and become paralyzed, as if a great weight has been laid upon her. It is not just a spiritual crisis, it is a physical manifestation of her psychological distress. Her visions do not cease, they intensify. The pressure to record them becomes unbearable. She finally confides in one of the monks at Disibodenberg, a man named Valmar. He is a patient and learned man, and he listens to her with an open mind. He is one of the few people who believes her, who sees not madness but a divine calling. With his encouragement, and the support of her fellow nuns, she makes a momentous decision. In the year 1141, at the age of 43, Hildegard begins to write. She begins her first great work, a book she will title Civias, which is a contraction of Scivias Domini, meaning Know the Ways of the Lord. It is a monumental undertaking, a collection of 26 of her most significant visions, each one a rich tapestry of symbolism and theological insight. She dictates the visions to Valmar, who acts as her secretary, carefully transcribing her words. Her visions are not simple tales, they are cosmic landscapes, intricate symbolic diagrams, and theological expositions that span the history of salvation. The language she uses is a powerful and poetic blend of Latin and German, a language born of a mind steeped in scripture and the natural world. The news of a cloistered nun who is writing a book of divine visions slowly begins to spread. Word reaches the ears of powerful men, including Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential figures in the church at the time. Bernard is a renowned Cistercian abbot, a charismatic preacher, and a counselor to popes and kings. He is also a deeply cautious man, wary of anyone who claims direct divine inspiration. He writes to Hildegard, and in his letter, he expresses a mix of curiosity and skepticism. He advises her to be careful, to test the spirits, but he does not dismiss her outright. His cautious support gives her a crucial layer of legitimacy. The true test comes when Pope Eugenius III hears of her work. He is a former student of Bernard of Clairvaux, and he is intrigued. He sends a commission to Disibodenberg to investigate Hildegard and her writings. The commission's task is simple: determine if she is a true visionary or a heretic. This is a high-stakes moment. If they find her to be a fraud, she could be excommunicated, her work destroyed, and her community disbanded. The commission arrives. They read her writings. They question her. Hildegard, a woman who has lived her life in the quiet solitude of the cloister, is now facing the highest authorities in the Christian world. Her visions, once a secret, are now on public display. The commission, after a thorough investigation, is convinced. They are not just convinced, they are astounded. The Pope himself reads a section of her Civias aloud at the Synod of Trier, a council of bishops and abbots. He not only approves her work but also grants her permission to continue writing and to preach publicly. This papal endorsement is a watershed moment, not just for Hildegard, but for the history of women in the Church. She is no longer just a nun with private visions, She is a recognized prophet, a Sibyl of the Rhine, with the full backing of the Church. With this newfound authority, Hildegard embarks on her most ambitious project yet. She decides to move her community of nuns out of the shadow of the monks at Disibodenberg and establish her own independent monastery. This is a radical, almost revolutionary act. It means leaving the safety and protection of the established male-led community. The abbot of Disibodenberg is vehemently opposed. He argues that the nuns are a financial asset, that their departure will be a blow to the monastery's resources. But Hildegard is unyielding. She argues that her visions have commanded her to do this, that God has shown her the exact location for her new home, a hill overlooking the Rhine River, near the town of Bingen. She stands her ground, and eventually, the abbot relents. The move to Rupertsberg, as the new monastery is called, is a physical embodiment of Hildegard's independence and her newfound authority. She and her nuns build the monastery from the ground up, with the help of local benefactors. She has to manage the finances, the construction, the daily lives of the women in her care. It is an immense undertaking, a testament to her strength of will and her practical leadership. She is not just a mystic, she is an abbess, a builder, and a shrewd administrator. She has navigated the treacherous waters of church politics and emerged victorious. But with this victory comes a new set of challenges, and the life of a prophet is never a peaceful one. The world is changing, and Hildegard, the quiet nun who once feared to speak, is about to become an active participant in its tumultuous history. Her work is far from finished, and the journey that began in the quiet isolation of a cell is about to expand in ways she could never have imagined. Her writings and her reputation are just the beginning. The next chapter will see her step out of her cloister and into the wider world, a world of popes, emperors, and social upheaval. What will she do with this new platform, this unprecedented voice? The establishment of the monastery at Rupertsberg marks the beginning of Hildegard's most active and influential period. She is no longer a hidden mystic, she is a public figure. With papal approval in her own monastery, she has a platform unlike any other woman of her time. Her reputation as a visionary and a prophet spreads throughout Europe. Kings, emperors, abbots, and common people write to her, seeking her advice and her prayers. She is a spiritual counselor, a political advisor, and a moral compass for a continent in turmoil. Her letters, which number in the hundreds, reveal her deep engagement with the issues of the day. She does not shy away from confronting the powerful. She scolds emperors for their political transgressions and challenges popes to live up to their spiritual responsibilities. Her courage is as remarkable as her visions. Her fame leads her to undertake what is, for a woman of her age and time, an almost unbelievable endeavor, preaching tours. In the 12th century, women were not permitted to preach publicly. But Hildegard, with her unique papal dispensation, travels throughout Germany, speaking to monks, nuns, and lay people. She preaches in the great cathedrals of Trier, Cologne, and Mainz. Her sermons are not the dry theological lectures of the day. They are passionate and vivid, filled with the imagery of her visions. She speaks of the need for reform in the Church, of the corruption she sees in its hierarchy, and of the importance of living a life of Christian virtue. Her audiences are captivated. She is not just a voice, she is a force of nature. Beyond her religious writings and public life, Hildegard is a polymath, a person of wide-ranging knowledge and expertise. She is a gifted composer, and her collection of musical works, titled Symphonia Harmoniae Celestium Revelationum, Symphony of the Harmony of Heavenly Revelations, is one of the largest bodies of work by a single medieval composer. Her music is a departure from the traditional Gregorian chant. It is intricate and emotionally expressive, a fusion of sacred and artistic sensibilities. She believed that music was a way to connect with the divine, a reflection of the celestial harmony of the universe. Her most enduring and perhaps most practical legacy is her work in natural science and medicine. She wrote 2 major books on these subjects, Physica and Causae et Curae. Physica is a comprehensive text on natural history, detailing the properties of plants, animals, and minerals and their uses in healing. She describes herbs like fennel, sage, and mint, listing their medicinal properties and applications. It is not just a simple list, she includes the spiritual and cosmic properties of each plant, reflecting her belief that the natural world is a reflection of the divine order. Causae et Curae, Causes and Cures, is a book on human health and disease. It covers everything from the causes of illness to treatments for various ailments, often drawing on herbal remedies. She writes about the importance of a balanced diet, proper sleep, and hygiene, ideas that feel surprisingly modern. She also writes about the greeness or viriditas of the natural world, a concept central to her thought, which she saw as the life-giving force of God. Her work laid the groundwork for herbal medicine in Europe for centuries. Hildegard's final years are spent at her beloved Rupertsberg, where she continues to write and lead her community. She is a living legend, a woman whose life is a testament to the power of faith and the resilience of the human spirit. She faces one last challenge in her final years, a dispute with the clergy of Mainz over the burial of an excommunicated man in her monastery's cemetery. She is ordered to disinter the body, but she refuses, arguing that the man had reconciled with the church before his death. She is placed under an interdict, a severe punishment that means her monastery cannot receive the sacraments or celebrate Mass. But she stands firm, and after months of negotiation, the interdict is lifted. It is a final act of defiance, a quiet victory for her convictions. Hildegard of Bingen dies on September 17, 1179, at the age of 81. Her life is a profound testament to the power of an individual to shape history, even when born into a world that would seem to offer no such opportunities. She was a woman in a man's world, a sickly child who became a spiritual titan, a quiet nun who became a public prophet. Her story teaches us that even in the most rigid and seemingly unchangeable of societies, there is always room for a voice that is authentic, a vision that is true. Her legacy endures not just in her writings and music, but in the idea that the seemingly boring details of a life lived with conviction can become the very foundation of history, a quiet rebellion that echoes across the centuries. You are settled now, the quiet echoes of a nun's life fading into the deep past. We are moving forward in time, 2 centuries into a new era. The year is 1290, and the place is England. We are in a world fundamentally different from Hildegard's, yet one still defined by faith, power, and the complex relationships between peoples. The Norman conquest of 1066 has long passed, and a new, distinctively English identity is beginning to solidify. The kingdom is under the rule of King Edward I, a man known for his military prowess, his legal reforms, and his deep piety. He is a formidable figure, a crusader who views his reign as a divine mission to bring order and righteousness to his kingdom. The Jewish community in England has existed for over 200 years, since the time of William the Conqueror. They were not invited to England out of a spirit of tolerance, they were brought for a specific purpose. As Christians were forbidden by the church from charging interest on loans, a practice known as usury, the Jewish community, unconstrained by this particular Christian doctrine, filled a critical economic role. They became the financiers and moneylenders to the crown and to the nobility. This was not a life of luxury. It was a life of extreme vulnerability. The king considered all Jews in his realm to be his personal property, a concept known as servi camerae regis, servants of the king's chamber. They were subject to his whims, taxed heavily, and their movements and lives were tightly controlled. They lived in specific quarters, often near the castles or administrative centers of towns, for their own protection and for the ease of surveillance. Life for a Jewish family in medieval England was a precarious balance. Imagine the daily routine, a constant low-level anxiety. You are an essential part of the kingdom's economic engine, yet you are also a perpetual outsider. You cannot own land, join guilds, or participate in the political life of the country. Your primary value is your financial service. This created a paradoxical existence. On one hand, you were protected by the crown as a valuable asset. On the other hand, this protection was a double-edged sword. If the king needed money, he would simply levy a heavy tax on the Jewish community. When he needed a scapegoat for the kingdom's economic woes or to win favor with the nobility and clergy, the Jews were the first to be blamed. By the late 13th century, this precarious balance was deteriorating. The English nobility, burdened by debt to Jewish moneylenders, agitated for relief. The clergy, driven by a wave of religious fervor and anti-Jewish sentiment, preached against the Jews, accusing them of various crimes, including ritual murder, the blood libel, and desecrating the host. These accusations were entirely unfounded, but they spread like wildfire, fueling a climate of fear and hatred. King Edward I, meanwhile, was facing his own financial troubles. His extensive wars in Wales and his preparations for a crusade were incredibly costly. He had already attempted to squeeze more money from the Jewish community through exorbitant taxes, but there was little left to take. He had also passed the Statute of the Jewry in 1275, which banned usury and forced Jews into other professions. This law effectively crippled the very economic role that had made them valuable, leaving them in a desperate state. The king's solution to his problems was both cynical and politically astute. He had a deep-seated desire to be a good Christian king, to purify his kingdom of what he and many others saw as a spiritual blight. He also had a strategic need for money. The stage was set for a dramatic and tragic turning point. The economic usefulness of the Jews had diminished, and the religious fervor against them had reached a fever pitch. Edward I saw an opportunity to gain both wealth and immense public favor. But to do so, he would have to make a choice that would permanently alter the social and religious landscape of England. He had already proven his willingness to act ruthlessly in the name of piety and politics. The next logical step, for him, was to address what was widely seen as the Jewish problem once and for all. The question was not if he would act, but how he would do it, and what form the final, decisive blow would take. What would a king do when a valuable but reviled minority was no longer useful to him, and in fact, had become a political liability? The answer to that question came swiftly and brutally. On July 18, 1290, King Edward I issued the Edict of Expulsion. The text of the edict was deceptively simple. It gave the Jewish community of England just over 3 months, until November 1st, to leave the kingdom. They were permitted to take their personal property with them, but all of their debts, homes, and lands were to be confiscated by the crown. The punishment for any Jew found in England after the deadline was death. Imagine the sudden, jarring shock. A family in York, a merchant in London, a scholar in Lincoln, all were suddenly confronted with an impossible choice. They were to abandon centuries of life, their homes, their livelihoods, and their ancestors' graves. The edict was not a surprise in a broad sense. The pressure on the community had been building for decades. But the finality and scale of it were unprecedented. There had been expulsions from smaller towns before, but never from the entire kingdom. The edict was a national and permanent decree. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. There was a desperate scramble to sell possessions, to settle affairs, and to prepare for a journey into the unknown. The king, ever the pragmatist, appointed a committee to oversee the expulsion and the confiscation of property. He even provided a small, temporary grace period for those who could not find passage, allowing them to seek refuge in a few designated ports. This was not a gesture of kindness. It was a way to ensure the process was orderly and that the crown received its full share of the confiscated assets. The journey itself was fraught with danger. The expelled Jews were now entirely at the mercy of the elements and the people they encountered. While the king had provided for their safe passage to the ports, the reality on the ground was often different. Many were robbed and attacked on their way to the coast. The most notorious incident occurred on the Thames River, where a group of wealthy Jews had paid for passage on a ship. The captain, after sailing a short distance, anchored in the middle of the river, and at low tide, tricked his passengers into disembarking, claiming they were near land. He then abandoned them on a sandbank, where they all drowned as the tide came in. The captain was later arrested and hanged for his crime, but it was little consolation to the lost lives. Approximately 16,000 Jews were expelled from England. This was not a small number. It represented a significant portion of the kingdom's population and a critical part of its financial structure. They were forced to disperse across Europe, seeking refuge in France, Germany, the Low Countries, and eventually Poland. The expulsion created a ripple effect, shifting Jewish populations and leading to a consolidation of communities in other parts of the continent. For the Jewish people, it was a major event in a long history of forced migrations and persecution. For England, it was a unique moment. The motive for Edward I was a complex blend of piety, populism, and pragmatism. By expelling the Jews, he was seen by the clergy and the general populace as a righteous king who had cleansed his realm of a perceived spiritual corruption. The move was widely celebrated. In return for the edict, Parliament granted him a new, substantial tax, a 15th, which helped fund his continued military campaigns. He gained both popular support and the financial resources he desperately needed. The Jewish problem, as he saw it, had been solved. He had eliminated the political and religious friction surrounding the community and had filled his coffers in the process. But the story of the expulsion did not end with the departure of the last ship. England was now a kingdom without a Jewish population, a situation that would last for over 350 years. This absence would have a profound and lasting impact on English society, culture, and finance. The vacuum left by the Jewish moneylenders was quickly filled by Christian merchants from Italy and Germany, who were not bound by the same religious restrictions. But the deeper, more subtle consequences were just beginning. The event would be forgotten by many, becoming a quiet, unexamined part of English history. The lives of the expelled were just one part of the story. The long shadow of their absence was another. What would England look like without a Jewish population for nearly 4 centuries, and what would it mean for those who were forced to leave? The Edict of Expulsion of 1290 had a lasting, almost imperceptible impact on England. For over 350 years, until the time of Oliver Cromwell in the mid-17th century, there was no officially sanctioned Jewish community in the country. This absence created a unique historical anomaly. England was a major European power that had no resident Jewish population, a fact that both isolated it from and distinguished it from the rest of the continent. The immediate consequences of the expulsion were economic. The void left by the Jewish community was not a financial collapse, but it was a significant shift. The Italian financiers from Lombardy and the bankers from Florence and Siena, who had already been operating in England, quickly took over the role of money lending and credit provision. They were Christians, and thus not subject to the same social and religious pressures. They filled the gap, and the wheels of the English economy continued to turn, but the nature of finance had changed. It was now more diffuse and less centrally controlled by the crown. The king lost his direct access to a captive financial asset, and he had to rely more on parliamentary grants and loans from foreign financiers. The social and cultural impact was perhaps more profound and enduring. The absence of a Jewish community meant that the religious and social tensions that defined so much of continental European history were not present in England in the same way. The blood libels, the forced conversions, and the ghettoization that became common in places like Spain and the German principalities were not a feature of English life. This absence created a kind of amnesia. Generations of English people grew up with no direct knowledge or interaction with a Jewish community. The image of the Jew in the English imagination was shaped almost entirely by religious texts, popular lore, and the unflattering depictions in plays and literature, most notably in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, a work written in the late 16th century, long after the expulsion. The character of Shylock, a vengeful and greedy Jewish moneylender, became a powerful and enduring stereotype, a caricature born from a lack of real-world interaction. The expelled Jews, meanwhile, continued their lives in exile. They were absorbed into the existing Jewish communities of Europe, particularly in France, where they were tolerated for a few more years before being expelled again, and in the Low Countries, Spain, and Portugal. The Sephardic Jews of the Iberian Peninsula would face their own, far more brutal, expulsion just over 200 years later. But the English expulsion of 1290 was a precedent, a chilling example of a monarch using his power to ethnically cleanse his kingdom in the name of piety and political expediency. It was a quieter, more bureaucratic kind of persecution, but it was no less absolute. The story of the expulsion of 1290 is a boring history because it is not filled with great battles or dramatic political conspiracies. It is a story of economics, bureaucracy, and the quiet, tragic consequences of political convenience. It shows how the seemingly mundane details of a society's financial system and religious beliefs can lead to a seismic, life-altering event for thousands of people. It is a powerful example of how a government, with a stroke of a pen, can erase a community that has been an integral part of its fabric for centuries. The legacy of this event is a long, slow shadow that stretches across centuries. It is the story of how an entire nation's memory of a people can be erased, and in its place, a harmful and enduring stereotype can be created. The return of the Jews to England, championed by Oliver Cromwell in the 1650s, was not a sudden and widespread event. It was a slow and gradual process, a cautious re-entry into a country that had forgotten their very existence. The expulsion of 1290, therefore, is not just a footnote in a history book, it is a profound lesson on the fragility of minority rights and the deep, lasting consequences of a king's political choices. It is a reminder that history is not just about what happened, but also about what was deliberately left out. You are drifting forward again, through the centuries, past kings and nuns, past expulsions and migrations, to a world that hums with the new vibrations of industry. The year is 1919. We are in Boston, Massachusetts, a city on the cusp of a new era. World War I has just ended, and a sense of bustling, almost frantic, energy permeates the air. The city's north end is a densely populated neighborhood, a mosaic of immigrant communities, primarily Italian and Irish. Its streets are narrow, winding, and crowded with tenements, small shops, and the daily clamor of urban life. In the midst of this vibrant chaos stands a massive, unadorned steel tank. It is not an elegant structure. It is 50 feet high and 90 feet in diameter, holding over 2.3 million gallons of molasses. The tank belongs to the Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. The molasses is a valuable commodity, a key ingredient in the production of industrial alcohol, a component of munitions during the war, and a primary ingredient for rum. The tank itself has been a source of complaints from the locals for months. It creaks and groans, and a dark, syrupy liquid often leaks from its seams, pooling in the street and attracting swarms of insects. The neighborhood children, however, find it a source of amusement, collecting the sweet drips on sticks for a makeshift treat. The tank was built in a hurry in 1915 to keep up with the war effort's demand for industrial alcohol. The construction was shoddy, rushed, and overseen by an inexperienced team. The steel plates were too thin for the immense pressure of the liquid inside, and a proper hydro test, a procedure where a tank is filled with water to check for leaks and structural integrity, was never performed. The foreman, a man named Arthur Gell, had no engineering experience. He simply built the tank and ignored the red flags. The pressure on the tank was immense, especially with a full load. Molasses is far denser and heavier than water, and on this cold January day, the fermenting contents inside were creating an additional buildup of carbon dioxide, adding to the internal pressure. The air is cold, but the molasses inside is warm from its fermentation. The day is January 15th, a Tuesday. The time is just past noon. The streets are a tapestry of ordinary life. A group of firefighters is having lunch at their station. A horse-drawn trolley is making its rounds. Children are playing on their way home from school. A few teamsters are making deliveries. There is no hint of the impending catastrophe. The sound of the city is a blend of horse hooves on cobblestones, a few early automobiles, and the distant clatter of a passing elevated train. It is a moment of tranquil normalcy, a boring slice of life in a bustling industrial city. But deep within the steel shell of the tank, the pressure is reaching a breaking point. The stress on the weak seams, exacerbated by the temperature changes and the fermenting contents, is too much. The groaning has stopped. It has been replaced by a quiet, almost imperceptible stillness, the kind of silence that precedes a great and violent event. The scene is set. All the ingredients for a disaster are in place: a faulty structure, a dense and powerful substance, and a densely populated urban area. The question is not if the tank will fail, but when, and with what speed and force will its contents be unleashed upon the unsuspecting city. At approximately 12:30 p.m., the immense steel tank at 529 Commercial Street gave out with a thunderous roar. Eyewitnesses later described the sound as a series of sharp cracks, like a machine gun firing, followed by a deafening boom. The tank ruptured, and a 25-foot-high wave of thick, brown molasses, traveling at an estimated 35 miles per hour, erupted into the streets of Boston's North End. The force of the wave was immense. It was a liquid battering ram, a slow-motion avalanche of goo. The wave was so powerful it ripped a nearby elevated train off its tracks, toppling it and burying its passengers. The Purity Distilling Company building was crushed. Tenements were swept from their foundations, their wooden structures splintering like kindling. A firehouse was inundated, and the firefighters inside were carried away by the powerful current. The devastation was immediate and catastrophic. The molasses, with its high density, was far more destructive than a wave of water. It was heavy, sticky, and unforgiving. People were caught completely by surprise. The sheer volume of the liquid was overwhelming. It filled the streets and alleys, trapping horses, wagons, and people. The horse-drawn trolley mentioned earlier was tossed about like a toy, its driver and passengers plunged into the sticky depths. The molasses proved to be a deadly paradox. It was too dense to swim in, and its syrupy nature meant that victims were quickly stuck, their movements restricted. The wave's momentum was so great that it carried people and debris along with it, crushing them against buildings or burying them in the thick sludge. The initial reports were confused and almost unbelievable. The police and fire departments, hearing the news, assumed it was a hoax or a prank. But as the calls poured in, and the first responders reached the scene, the grotesque reality became clear. The first rescuers faced an almost impossible task. The molasses was several feet deep, and they had to wade through it to reach victims. The density of the liquid made every step a struggle. They found people trapped under debris, submerged in the molasses, or stuck fast to the ground. The rescue effort was a desperate and heroic undertaking. Firefighters and police officers worked tirelessly, using ropes and ladders to pull victims from the sludge. The molasses was also dangerously cold, contributing to the hypothermia of those who were trapped. The victims were not just suffocated, they were also crushed, their bones broken by the weight of the debris carried by the wave. In the end, 21 people were killed, and over 150 were injured. The victims were a mix of ages and backgrounds, children, local residents, and workers. It was a disaster that transcended class and nationality, a cruel and random act of fate delivered by corporate negligence. The aftermath of the flood was a scene of surreal devastation. The entire area was coated in a thick layer of brown sludge. Buildings were tilted precariously, and debris was everywhere. The smell of molasses hung in the air for months, a cloying, sickly sweet reminder of the tragedy. The city of Boston launched a massive cleanup effort, but it was a long and difficult process. Molasses is not easy to wash away. Fire hoses were used, but the water only thinned the molasses, turning it into a slick, sticky mess. Salt water from the harbor was eventually used to break down the sugar, but the smell and stickiness persisted for weeks, even months. The court case that followed was one of the most significant in Massachusetts history. The city's residents and the victims' families sued the United States Industrial Alcohol Company for negligence. The company's defense was a ridiculous attempt to blame the disaster on a mysterious anarchist bomb. The trial lasted for years, with thousands of pages of testimony from engineers, witnesses, and experts. It became a landmark case, a testament to the fact that even in an age of rapid industrialization, corporations could be held accountable for their carelessness. The Great Molasses Flood is a truly unique disaster. It lacks the scale of a great fire or a massive earthquake, yet its sheer absurdity and unique nature make it a compelling story. It is a perfect example of boring history, a disaster caused not by a dramatic conspiracy or a natural force, but by a series of mundane, predictable, and utterly preventable failures. A rushed construction, a missed inspection, a simple material, and a tragic outcome. It is a story that proves that even the most seemingly harmless of substances can, in the right, or wrong, circumstances, become a deadly weapon. The memory of the flood, and the smell of molasses, would linger in Boston's North End for years, a quiet, sweet-smelling ghost of a time when corporate greed proved to be a deadly force. You are moving forward once more, the sweet, cloying memory of molasses giving way to the smell of wood smoke and the quiet, industrious hum of another city on the verge of change. We are in London, in the year 1666. The city is a vibrant, bustling metropolis, the heart of the English kingdom. It is a place of immense contrasts, home to the Grand St. Paul's Cathedral and the Royal Exchange, but also a labyrinth of narrow, winding streets, packed with timber-framed houses. These houses, with their upper floors overhanging the streets below, are built so close together that neighbors can lean out of their windows and shake hands across the narrow alleys. The city is a tinderbox. The buildings are primarily constructed of wood and pitch, their roofs covered in flammable thatch. The streets are a jumble of workshops and small businesses, where coopers work with fire, bakers use hot ovens, and smiths forge iron. Sanitation is rudimentary, waste and refuse are often simply thrown into the streets. The city has recently suffered from a devastating outbreak of the Great Plague, which had killed tens of thousands just a year before. The air is still heavy with the memory of the sick and the dying, and the city's population, though recovering, is still fragile. The reigning monarch is King Charles II, a man who has recently been restored to the throne after years of civil war and the rule of Oliver Cromwell's puritanical Commonwealth. His court is a lively place, filled with artists, scientists, and political intrigues. But beyond the court, the city is a sleeping giant, a great wooden monster waiting for a spark. The city's firefighting methods are medieval at best. There is no professional fire service. The primary method of fighting a fire is by creating a fire break, pulling down houses in the path of the blaze to prevent its spread. This is a slow, difficult, and often controversial process, requiring the agreement of property owners. The city's streets are too narrow for even the small, hand-pumped fire engines that exist, and access to the Thames River, the city's greatest water source, is often blocked. The stage is set for a disaster of epic proportions. The summer has been long and dry, and a strong east wind has been blowing for days. The city's inhabitants go about their daily lives, oblivious to the immense vulnerability of their home. They are a resilient people, accustomed to hardship and the ever-present threat of disease. They do not fear fire as a mass destroyer, they fear it as a local danger, or risk to their own home, but not to the entire city. The city's Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, is a man more concerned with political appointments than with public safety. He is about to make a series of fateful decisions that will have a direct and lasting impact on the lives of every person in London. The clock is ticking on a quiet Saturday night in September. What would a single, tiny spark, in an unassuming location, do to such a grand, yet fragile, city? The fire begins on the night of Saturday, September 2nd, 1666, in the bakehouse of Thomas Farriner, the King's Baker, on Pudding Lane. It is a small fire, and at first, it seems manageable. A few neighbors attempt to extinguish it, but the flames are tenacious, fed by the dried-out timber of the building. The fire quickly spreads to the nearby stables and outbuildings. The city's Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, is awakened and brought to the scene. His response is one of fatal indecision. When he is advised to pull down houses to create a fire break, he famously dismisses the idea with a sneer, saying, "Pish. A woman might piss it out." He fears the political and economic consequences of destroying property without the consent of the owners. His hesitation proves to be a catastrophic mistake. The wind, which had been blowing steadily from the east, picks up speed, carrying embers and sparks from house to house. The fire, which started as a single point of light, is now a living, breathing entity, leaping across the narrow streets. The fire grows in size and intensity. It is not a fast, raging inferno, but a slow, methodical advance. It consumes the city block by block, street by street. The heat is so intense that it creates its own wind, a firestorm that sucks in air and carries the flames with terrifying speed. The residents, at first complacent, begin to panic. They try to save what they can, but their efforts are chaotic and uncoordinated. People flee with their belongings, clogging the streets and making it impossible for the few firefighters to get through. The narrow streets, once a feature of the city, become death traps. On Monday, the fire reaches the city's heart. The Royal Exchange, the financial center of England, is engulfed. The flames consume the paper money and financial records stored inside, a symbolic and literal destruction of the city's wealth. The fire's reach is now undeniable, and the city's authorities are in a state of disarray. King Charles II himself takes charge, ordering the immediate demolition of houses and buildings. But by this point, it is almost too late. The fire is a behemoth, a force of nature that cannot be stopped by human hands. The fire is not a single, dramatic event. It is a series of quiet, devastating moments. The destruction of the city's medieval guilds, with their meticulously crafted records and traditions. The loss of countless books and manuscripts, including the first printing press in England, a silent bonfire of knowledge. The slow, creeping dread as the fire inches closer to St. Paul's Cathedral, a symbol of the city's faith and resilience. The heat of the fire is so intense that the lead roof of St. Paul's Cathedral melts and pours down the streets like a river. The cathedral, thought to be a safe haven, is gutted, a testament to the fire's immense power. The fire consumes approximately 13,200 houses and 87 parish churches, leaving an estimated 70,000 people homeless. The fire burns for 4 days, finally dying down on Wednesday, when the wind changes direction and the firefighters manage to create a decisive firebreak by using gunpowder to blow up entire streets of houses. The city is a smoldering ruin, a wasteland of ash and scorched earth. The immediate aftermath is a scene of human resilience and tragedy. Tens of thousands of people are huddled in camps outside the city walls, living in makeshift tents. Yet, remarkably, the official death toll is only a handful of people. This is a testament to the fire's slow-burning nature, which gave people time to flee. However, many historians now believe the real number was much higher, as the poor and undocumented would not have been counted. The lives and livelihoods of the vast majority of the city's residents were gone. What was once a vibrant, chaotic metropolis was now a scarred and empty landscape. But this was not the end of the story. The fire, which had destroyed the old London, also cleared the way for something entirely new. What would rise from the ashes of this great disaster, and how would it change the city, and the country, forever? The Great Fire of London, for all its destructive power, was not a final act of history, but a beginning. The city, which had been a tangled medieval mess of wooden houses and narrow streets, was now a blank slate. The destruction, which had been a tragedy for thousands, became an unprecedented opportunity for a handful of visionary men. King Charles II immediately set up a commission to plan the city's reconstruction. He had a personal interest in the project, as did the city's inhabitants, who were eager to rebuild their homes and businesses. The most notable figure in this reconstruction was Sir Christopher Wren, an astronomer and architect who would go on to design a new St. Paul's Cathedral and many of the city's new churches. The rebuilding of London was a slow, methodical, and often frustrating process. Wren and other architects submitted ambitious plans for a new city of wide, straight avenues, grand plazas, and uniform brick buildings. But the old property lines, which had been a jumble of ancient rights and titles, were almost impossible to erase. The King's Commission had to balance the need for a modern city with the rights of private landowners. Ultimately, the new London was built on the old street plan, but with significant improvements. A new building code was enacted, mandating that all new houses be built of brick or stone, with no overhanging upper floors. This was a crucial step in fire prevention, a lesson learned at great cost. The streets were made wider, and a new public sewer system was installed. The construction of the new city was a massive undertaking, a feat of human will and ingenuity. It was a project that employed tens of thousands of masons, carpenters, and laborers. The skyline of the new London was defined by the churches that Wren designed, which were not just places of worship but also symbols of the city's spiritual resilience. The new St. Paul's Cathedral, a masterpiece of Baroque architecture, took over 30 years to build and stands as a testament to the scale of the rebuilding effort. It was a project of public and private investment, a quiet, industrious act of creation that followed a public and dramatic act of destruction. The boring nature of this history is not in the fire itself, but in the painstaking, years-long process that followed. It is in the bureaucratic details of a new building code, the endless negotiations over property lines, and the quiet, unsung labor of the people who laid the bricks and mixed the mortar. The Great Fire of London is often remembered as a single, dramatic event, but its true historical significance lies in the fact that it forced London to be reborn as a modern city. The old medieval city of wood and thatch was gone forever, and in its place, a new city of brick and stone was built, a city that was safer, healthier, and more resilient. The fire also had a subtle, yet profound, impact on the collective memory of the English people. It became a powerful symbol of their resilience, a story they told themselves about their ability to overcome disaster. The monument, a tall column designed by Wren to commemorate the fire, stands to this day, a silent witness to a tragedy that led to a rebirth. The fire is a reminder that some of the most important events in history are not planned, they are accidental, and they are not just about what is lost, but about what is gained. The Great Fire of London was a defining moment in the history of the city, a crucible that forged its modern identity and created a template for urban planning that would be copied for centuries. The story is a lesson that even the most destructive of events can, in the end, lead to a better and stronger future, built brick by boring brick. You are drifting into a new time, a new place, and a new kind of history. We are in the year 1720, and the setting is London, England. This is the dawn of the Age of Enlightenment, a time of reason, science, and burgeoning global trade. The city has long since rebuilt itself from the ashes of the Great Fire, and it now stands as the center of a rapidly expanding British Empire. The coffee houses of London are buzzing with conversation, not about war or religion, but about something far more modern and, for a time, more intoxicating, investment and speculation. The central character in this story is not a king or a visionary nun, but a company, the South Sea Company. Founded in 1711, its purpose was seemingly noble and grand, to trade with the Spanish colonies of South America. The company was granted a monopoly on this trade by the British government. But there was a problem. A war with Spain had just ended, and a new one was brewing. The Spanish were not inclined to open up their lucrative colonies to British merchants. The company's grand trade mission was, in reality, a sham. It was a trading company that did very little trading. So why was it created? The South Sea Company was a brilliant, if deeply cynical, financial scheme designed to solve a very boring but pressing national problem, the national debt. After years of costly wars, Britain had accumulated an enormous debt. The government's solution was to have the South Sea Company take on a portion of this debt. In a complex and convoluted arrangement, the government would sell its debt to the South Sea Company, and in return, the company would issue shares to the public. These shares were supposed to be paid for with the government bonds held by the people. The promise was simple: the company would make so much money from its supposed trade with South America that its shares would be incredibly valuable, far more valuable than the government debt. The public, for its part, was ripe for such a scheme. The financial markets of the early 18th century were a wild and unregulated place. The modern concepts of stock analysis, risk management, and market regulation did not exist. There was a widespread and almost infectious belief in the promise of easy wealth. The South Sea Company's shares began to rise, not because of any real profits from trade, but because of the frenzied excitement of the public. The company's directors fueled this frenzy, spreading rumors of lucrative voyages and fantastic profits. The price of a single share, which started at £128 at the beginning of the year, began a meteoric ascent. The South Sea Company was a bubble, a classic example of mass delusion. Its value was based on nothing more than the public's confidence and a seemingly endless stream of new investors. It was the epitome of a boring history because its rise was driven by financial paperwork, arcane debt conversions, and a slow, almost hypnotic, increase in share price. There were no battles or great speeches, just the quiet, relentless hum of a market gone mad. As the company's shares climbed, so too did the public's faith. Everyone, from the lowest servants to the highest nobility, was buying shares, convinced they were on the path to riches. But what happens when an entire nation's wealth is built on a foundation of pure speculation? The South Sea Company's shares continued their dizzying ascent throughout the spring and early summer of 1720. The price rose from £128 in January to a peak of over £1,000 by June. The mania was all-consuming. Everyone wanted a piece of the action. People sold their homes, their land, and their family heirlooms to buy shares. The company directors, now obscenely rich, used their newfound wealth to bribe politicians and members of the royal family, ensuring that the government would not interfere with their scheme. The company had essentially become the government's de facto banker, holding the national debt and paying out a steady, though fictitious, dividend. The South Sea Company was not the only bubble in town. The success of the scheme led to a wave of speculative frenzy. Dozens of new companies, most of them with nonsensical or fraudulent business plans, were created. There was the company for a wheel of perpetual motion, the company for importing hair from asses, and most famously, the company for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. This last one was so absurd that it managed to raise a significant amount of money in a single day before its promoter fled the country. The government, alarmed by the proliferation of these bubble companies and the threat they posed to the South Sea Company's monopoly, passed the Bubble Act in June 1720. This law, ironically, was intended to protect the South Sea Company by making it illegal for other companies to issue shares without a royal charter. The result was a disaster. The Bubble Act did not stop the frenzy, it simply funneled all the speculative money back into the South Sea Company. The price of its shares skyrocketed to a new peak, but the law also served as a warning sign. People began to realize that the smaller companies they had invested in were now worthless. The collapse was not a sudden bang, but a slow, agonizing leak. In August 1720, a number of large investors began to sell their shares, quietly at first, and then with increasing urgency. The price of the stock began to fall, slowly at first, but then with a terrifying speed. As the news of the declining price spread, a massive panic set in. Everyone wanted to sell, and no one wanted to buy. The market, which had been so flush with cash just weeks before, was now a dried-up desert. The price of the stock plummeted. By September, it was back down to around £150, and by the end of the year, it was worthless. The bubble had burst. The result was a quiet, financial Armageddon. The fortunes of thousands of people were wiped out overnight. The dreams of servants, the savings of merchants, and the inheritances of the nobility were all gone. The country was in a state of shock. Banks failed, businesses went bankrupt, and a profound sense of betrayal settled over the nation. Parliament launched an investigation, and the scale of the corruption was breathtaking. The company directors had grown fabulously rich through their deception, and many of them, along with their political allies, were arrested. Their assets were seized and sold to compensate the victims, but it was a small consolation. The nation had learned a painful lesson. The South Sea Bubble is not a story of a great battle or a revolutionary idea. It is a story of human greed, the fragility of a new financial system, and the quiet, crushing reality of a market collapse. It is the story of a nation's collective delusion, a moment in history when the promise of easy wealth blinded an entire society. The aftermath was not a revolution, but a series of quiet, bureaucratic changes that would have a profound and lasting impact on the way people thought about finance and investment. The question, now that the dust had settled and the wealth had vanished, was how the nation would recover, and what lasting lessons would it learn from the ashes of this financial ruin. You are drifting now, the quiet echoes of financial ruin giving way to the rumbling of the earth itself. We are in the year 1755, and our setting is Lisbon, Portugal. At this time, Lisbon is one of the greatest cities in the world. It is the heart of a vast empire, a global hub of trade, and a city of immense wealth and religious piety. Its harbor is a forest of masts, a constant procession of ships arriving from Brazil, laden with gold, spices, and exotic goods. The city itself is a marvel of Baroque and Rococo architecture, with magnificent palaces, grand churches, and a population of over 200,000 souls. It is a city that feels permanent, a monument to human ingenuity and divine favor. The day is November 1st, All Saints' Day. It is a holy day, and the city's inhabitants are at church. The air is filled with the scent of incense and the sound of bells. The morning is quiet and clear. The world is in a state of intellectual ferment. The Enlightenment is in full swing. Philosophers in France and Britain are questioning traditional authority, promoting reason and scientific inquiry. They are debating the nature of God, the order of the universe, and the role of man in the cosmos. In Lisbon, this intellectual curiosity is a vibrant part of the city's life, and the city itself is a symbol of a divinely ordered, stable world. The city's wealth and splendor are seen as proof of God's favor. But underneath this facade of permanence, a quiet geological reality is waiting. Lisbon sits on a fault line, a fact entirely unknown to its inhabitants. The city's coastal location, which makes it a great trading port, also makes it vulnerable to a specific type of geological event. The people of 1755 have no concept of a seismic event. Earthquakes, when they happen, are seen as acts of God, as punishment for sin, or as a mysterious natural occurrence. They are not understood in terms of shifting tectonic plates. This ignorance is a key ingredient in the tragedy that is about to unfold. The stage is set for a disaster that will not only destroy a city but will also shake the very foundations of European philosophy and science. It will force the great thinkers of the day to confront a profound and terrifying question: if a beautiful, pious city can be destroyed on a holy day, what does it say about the nature of God? The people of Lisbon are in their churches, kneeling in prayer, utterly unaware that the ground beneath them is about to become a living, breathing thing, an instrument of chaos and destruction. What will happen when a city's faith and philosophical certainty are confronted by a raw, unyielding force of nature? At approximately 9:40 a.m. on November 1, 1755, the earth began to shake. The initial tremors lasted for several minutes, a terrifying, violent convulsion that was unlike anything the people of Lisbon had ever experienced. The ground rolled and heaved, and the city's magnificent stone buildings, designed to withstand the winds and rains of a coastal city, were no match for the raw power of the seismic waves. Grand churches, filled with people at prayer, collapsed, their roofs falling in and their walls crumbling. Palaces and tenements were reduced to rubble. The air was filled with the sounds of crashing masonry and the screams of a city in agony. The first wave of the disaster was the earthquake itself, a colossal natural force that is now estimated to have been a magnitude of 8.5 to 9.0 on the Richter scale. The devastation was widespread. An estimated 85% of Lisbon's buildings were destroyed or heavily damaged. The city's famous opera house, which had opened just months earlier, was among the first to be utterly annihilated. The royal palace, with its priceless royal archives and paintings, was also gone. The city was a smoking, dusty ruin, and a new terror was about to begin. For those who had survived the initial collapse, a second, more insidious threat emerged. The thousands of candles lit in the churches for All Saints' Day, combined with the stoves in the bakeries and homes, ignited. Fires broke out across the city, and the strong winds from the coast fanned the flames. The narrow streets, now choked with rubble, made it impossible for the few organized fire brigades to reach the blazes. The city became an inferno. The fires burned for 3 days, consuming what the earthquake had not. Many who had escaped the initial tremors were now trapped and burned alive in the streets. And then came the third and final wave of destruction. Approximately 40 minutes after the initial earthquake, a massive tsunami surged up the Tagus River. The waves, some as high as 20 feet, smashed into the city's harbor and waterfront. Thousands of people had fled the collapsing buildings and sought refuge on the open spaces of the wharves, believing they were safe there. They were swept out to sea and drowned. The ships in the harbor were tossed about like toys, many of them sinking or being dashed against the shore. The tsunami was a final, cruel blow to a city already on its knees. The death toll was staggering. While precise numbers are impossible to know, historians estimate that between 30,000 and 60,000 people were killed in Lisbon alone. The devastation was not confined to the city. The earthquake was felt as far away as Finland and the waves reached as far as the Caribbean. The event was not just a local disaster, it was a European-wide calamity. The Lisbon earthquake was a philosophical and scientific bombshell. For the thinkers of the Enlightenment, it posed a profound challenge to their worldview. Voltaire, the great French philosopher, was particularly shaken by the event. He saw the destruction of a beautiful and pious city on a holy day as a refutation of the idea of a benevolent, rational God who oversaw a perfectly ordered world. He famously satirized the philosophical optimism of the day in his novel Candide, where he mocked the idea that all is for the best in this best of all possible worlds. The event also spurred a new era of scientific inquiry. The Marquis de Pombal, the powerful Prime Minister of Portugal, took a radically new approach to the disaster. Instead of focusing on sin and punishment, he ordered a census of the dead and a scientific investigation into the earthquake's effects. He famously said, "Now what? We bury the dead and feed the living." His pragmatic, rational response was a direct application of Enlightenment principles to a real-world disaster. He ordered the city rebuilt in a logical, grid-like pattern, with new buildings designed to be more resistant to earthquakes. The event, in a sense, gave birth to modern seismology and a new, more rational approach to disaster management. The destruction of Lisbon was a profound moment in the history of science and philosophy, a quiet, rumbling event that forced a re-evaluation of the very nature of the universe. What was the meaning of this great, incomprehensible destruction, and how would it change the way people thought about their world? You are moving forward once more, away from the philosophical wreckage of a city and into the silent, vast emptiness of Siberia. The year is 1908. We are in a world on the brink of immense change. The great European empires are at their height, but underneath the surface, the tensions that will lead to a world war are simmering. Technology is advancing at a rapid pace, yet vast swaths of the globe remain unexplored and untamed. One of the last great wildernesses is Siberia, a place of frozen taiga forests and sparse settlements. It is a land of indigenous reindeer herders and Russian fur trappers, a place where life is a constant, quiet struggle against the elements. The date is June 30th. It is a clear, mild summer morning. The sky is a deep, cloudless blue. In a small trading post known as Vanavara, a man named Semyon Borisovich Ryabushkin sits on his porch. He is a local merchant, a quiet man who has lived his entire life in this remote corner of the world. He is preparing to go about his daily business, a monotonous cycle of trading furs for supplies. The silence of the taiga is absolute, a deep, pervasive quiet broken only by the chirping of birds and the occasional rustle of a wild animal. Approximately 40 miles to the northwest, in a place known as the Stony Tunguska River, the silence is about to be shattered. The area is uninhabited, a dense, remote forest of large trees. This is a boring setting, a place with no great cities, no famous battles, and no momentous events. It is a place that feels entirely outside of human history, a blank canvas of trees and emptiness. But in a few moments, this boring, quiet landscape will become the site of one of the greatest scientific mysteries of the 20th century. The event, when it happens, will be witnessed by no one up close. It will only be seen from a great distance, in the form of a brilliant flash and a subsequent shockwave. The cause will be a matter of intense debate for decades. Was it a meteorite? A comet? Something else entirely? The lack of any witnesses, combined with the extreme remoteness of the location, would ensure that the event would remain a mystery for a long time. The world, caught up in its own political dramas, would barely notice. The first official report would not be made for years, and the first scientific expedition would not arrive until almost 2 decades later. The Tunguska event is a quiet history, an event that happened, but one that was felt more as a question than as a fact. What was this great, silent explosion that shook the earth and yet left no trace of an impact? At approximately 7:17 a.m. local time, on June 30th, 1908, the world's largest known impact event in recorded history occurred. The Tunguska event was a massive explosion, an airburst caused by a celestial body, likely a comet or an asteroid, that detonated in the atmosphere approximately 3 to 6 miles above the Earth's surface. The explosion's force was immense, estimated to be equivalent to 10 to 15 megatons of TNT, or roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The lack of witnesses to the immediate event is a crucial part of its story. The only human presence was a few isolated indigenous Evenki people, whose reindeer herds were in the vicinity. They reported a blinding flash of light, followed by a shockwave that knocked them off their feet. The sound was heard for hundreds of miles, and the shockwave was strong enough to break windows in the town of Vanavara, over 40 miles away. For days afterward, the sky over Europe was filled with a strange, glowing light, a phenomenon caused by the dust and ice particles from the celestial body reflecting sunlight high in the atmosphere. It was a beautiful, ethereal sight that was not understood until decades later. The first scientific expedition to the area was not launched until 1927, almost 2 decades after the event. A Russian mineralogist named Leonid Kulik led the expedition. He had heard of the mysterious explosion and was determined to find a meteorite crater. He and his team arrived at the site and were met with a scene of surreal devastation. An area of over 800 square miles of dense taiga forest was flattened. The trees were not burned or scorched, they were simply toppled, all of them lying in a radial pattern, with their trunks pointing away from the center of the blast. The trees directly at the epicenter, however, were still standing, stripped of their branches and bark, but otherwise intact, their trunks like silent, charred sentinels. Kulik and his team searched for years, but they never found a crater or any remnants of a meteorite. The lack of any physical evidence of an impact was the central mystery of the Tunguska event. If it was a meteorite or an asteroid, where was the crater? This question led to a cascade of theories, some scientific, some fantastical. Was it a black hole? A piece of antimatter? A collapsing wormhole? The most widely accepted theory today is that it was an airburst. The celestial body, likely a rocky asteroid or a fragile comet, entered the Earth's atmosphere at a high speed. The immense pressure and friction caused it to heat up rapidly, and it detonated in the air before it could hit the ground. The explosion vaporized the object, leaving no crater and only a fine dust that was impossible to find. The Tunguska event is a boring history because its story is not one of human drama, but one of silent, scientific investigation. It is a story of a great event that happened in the most remote part of the world, with no one to witness it. It is a story of a mystery that was solved not with a dramatic discovery, but with the painstaking work of scientists and the slow accumulation of evidence. The event itself was a testament to the random and terrifying power of the universe, a silent warning that our planet is a moving target in a cosmic shooting gallery. What was this great, silent explosion that shook the Earth and yet left no trace of an impact? The answer, when it finally came, was more profound and humbling than any of the wilder theories. It was simply the universe reminding us of our place in it. You are moving forward in time again, the faint echoes of a Siberian explosion giving way to the overwhelming, nauseating smell of a bustling city in the heart of its empire. The year is 1858, and we are in London. This is a city at the height of its power, the capital of a global empire where the sun never sets. It is a place of immense wealth and grinding poverty, of grand new rail stations and the squalid slums of the East End. It is also a city of profound and growing problem, its waste. For centuries, London's waste disposal system was simple and unsophisticated. The city's inhabitants relied on cesspools, large, brick-lined pits dug beneath houses, and on the River Thames itself. As the city's population exploded in the 19th century, from 1 million in 1800 to over 2.5 million by the mid-1850s, this rudimentary system became a crisis. The cesspools were constantly overflowing, and the Thames, once a source of drinking water and a bustling thoroughfare, had become an open sewer. The city's drinking water was a toxic cocktail of raw sewage, industrial waste, and garbage. This wasn't just a matter of unpleasantness. It was a matter of life and death. The medical community was still grappling with the concept of disease. The prevailing theory was the miasma theory, which held that diseases like cholera and typhus were caused by bad air or foul smells. The constant presence of a terrible odor in the city's streets and river was seen as proof of a profound and dangerous public health threat. But the true cause of the diseases, as Dr. John Snow would prove a few years earlier, was the contaminated drinking water. The river, a source of both drinking water and a convenient dumping ground, was a silent and deadly killer. The summer of 1858 was long and hot. The heat was relentless, and the water level of the Thames was low. The combination created the perfect conditions for a public health catastrophe. The river, which was now a thick, brown sludge, began to reek with a smell so foul that it was described as the Great Stink. The odor was overwhelming, a mix of human waste, industrial runoff, and rotting refuse. It was not a smell that could be ignored. It permeated everything: the homes of the wealthy, the offices of government officials, and the very halls of Parliament. The government of the day was slow to act. The problem was seen as a private one, to be solved by private individuals and companies, not by the government. But the Great Stink changed everything. The smell was so bad that it forced the government to confront a problem it had long ignored. The members of Parliament, unable to tolerate the stench, were forced to hang curtains soaked in chloride of lime in the windows of the House of Commons, a futile and comical attempt to ward off the smell. The river had literally brought the city's profound social and health problems to the very doorstep of power. The city's leaders had long been able to ignore the poverty of the slums, but they could not ignore the foul odor that was now a part of their daily lives. The problem was no longer just a poor people's problem, it was a London problem. What would it take for a government to finally act on a problem that was not just a public nuisance, but a public health crisis? The Great Stink reached its climax in June and July of 1858. The air in London became almost unbreathable. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, on a pleasure cruise on the Thames, were forced to turn back, unable to tolerate the foul smell. The government, which had been paralyzed by inaction, was finally forced to confront the problem. The stench was not just a nuisance, it was an affront to their very dignity and their ability to govern. The members of Parliament could no longer ignore a problem that had literally seeped into their workplace. The public, for its part, was terrified. The miasma theory, for all its scientific inaccuracy, was a powerful motivator. If the smell was the source of disease, then the city was doomed. The person who would finally take charge of this monumental problem was Sir Joseph Bazalgette, a civil engineer who had been appointed chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works. For years, he had been advocating for a modern sewer system, but his plans had been repeatedly rejected as too expensive. The government, now desperate, gave him the green light to proceed. Bazalgette's plan was ambitious, and for its time, revolutionary. He proposed building a massive, interconnected network of sewers, all of which would flow away from the city and into the Thames at a point far downstream, where the tide would carry the waste out to sea. The project was a logistical and engineering marvel. It was not a simple task of digging trenches and laying pipes. London's geology, with its soft, muddy subsoil, was a nightmare for construction. Bazalgette's team had to navigate a labyrinth of existing buildings, ancient Roman ruins, and a jumble of private sewers. They had to build pumping stations to lift the sewage from lower areas to higher ones and to construct vast new embankments along the river to contain the sewers and create new public spaces. The work was slow, painstaking, and incredibly boring in its detail. It involved an army of workers, digging by hand, laying millions of bricks, and constructing miles of tunnels. The cost was immense, a staggering £6.5 million, an enormous sum for the time. The work was also a quiet victory of science and reason over superstition. While the public still believed in the miasma theory, the engineers were working from a more accurate understanding of fluid dynamics and public health. They were not just building a sewer system, they were building a new city, one that would be safer and healthier. The project was not a single, dramatic event, but a long, slow, and methodical process that would take over a decade to complete. The Great Stink was a public, sensory event. The solution was a quiet, unseen, and bureaucratic one. The construction of the new sewer system was a testament to the power of a government to act in the public good. It was a project that transcended politics and class, a response to a problem that affected everyone. The solution was not a quick fix, but a long-term investment in the city's future. The Great Stink, in a sense, was a gift. It was a catalyst for change, a smelly, disgusting catalyst that forced a nation to finally embrace the principles of public health and modern engineering. But what was the true legacy of this great, unpleasant event? The Great Stink of 1858 was a turning point, a moment when the City of London was forced to confront the fundamental challenges of its growth. The construction of Basilgate's sewer system was a monumental achievement, a quiet and meticulous victory that had a profound and lasting impact on the city's health and quality of life. The project was completed in 1865, and the results were almost immediate. The smell of the city improved dramatically, and the incidences of cholera and typhus plummeted. The apathetic government and public, once apathetic to the city's poor and their sanitation issues, had been forced into action by a problem that affected everyone, regardless of their station. The legacy of the Great Stink is not a single, dramatic event, but a fundamental shift in the way society viewed public health. It showed that large-scale, coordinated public works were not only possible but necessary. The sewer system was a testament to the power of a government to invest in its own people, not for the sake of profit or glory, but for the basic good of public health. It was a boring history in its execution, a decade of digging, bricklaying, and engineering, all done out of sight, beneath the streets of a city that was going about its daily business. Yet, this boring work had a more significant and lasting impact than any battle or political treaty. The lessons learned in London spread to other cities around the world. The model of a centralized, publicly funded sewer system became the standard for modern urban sanitation. Cities like Paris, New York, and Chicago all adopted similar systems, leading to a dramatic increase in life expectancy and a sharp decline in waterborne diseases. The Great Stink, in a sense, gave birth to modern public health. It proved that a problem that seemed insurmountable could be solved with the right combination of political will, scientific knowledge, and public investment. It was a quiet revolution, a victory of engineering over apathy, and a smelly, unforgettable lesson in the interconnectedness of human life. The story of the Great Stink is a powerful reminder that some of the most important events in history are not the ones that make headlines, but the ones that happen in the background. It is a story of a city's collective will to survive and thrive, even in the face of an almost unimaginable problem. The smell may have been unbearable, but the solution was a testament to human ingenuity and a quiet, profound act of civic responsibility. It is a lesson that echoes to this day, that the health of a city and its people is a public trust, and that sometimes, the greatest catalysts for change are the most unpleasant ones. You are drifting into a cold, desolate place, a world of ice and silence. We are in the year 1845, and we are on the deck of a ship, a vessel of iron and wood named HMS Erebus. She is a stout and powerful ship, a veteran of a long and distinguished career in naval exploration. Alongside her is her sister ship, HMS Terror. Together, they are the pride of the British Royal Navy, the most advanced ships of their kind, equipped with the latest technology, including reinforced iron bows, screw propellers, and a heating system for the crew's comfort. Their mission is a noble and ambitious one, to find the Northwest Passage, a mythical sea route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the frozen labyrinth of the Arctic. The expedition is led by Sir John Franklin, a respected and experienced naval officer. He is a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars and a seasoned Arctic explorer. The crew of 129 men is a mix of seasoned sailors and young, ambitious officers. They are a well-fed, well-equipped, and confident lot. Their ships are filled with enough provisions to last for 3 years, including thousands of pounds of preserved meat, vegetables, and flour. The ships also have a large library of books, scientific instruments, and even a camera, a new and exciting invention. The expedition is a product of its time, a blend of scientific curiosity, imperial ambition, and a romantic belief in the triumph of human ingenuity over nature. The initial phase of the expedition is a resounding success. They sail from England, cross the Atlantic, and make their way into the vast, icy waters of the Arctic. The last time the ships are seen by human eyes is in late July 1845, by a whaling vessel in Baffin Bay. The whalers report that the expedition is in good spirits, confident in its mission, and well provisioned. And then, silence. A quiet, deep, and unnerving silence that would last for years. The disappearance of the Franklin expedition is a boring history because there are no dramatic battles or great political speeches. There is only the slow, quiet erosion of a grand ambition in the face of a cold and unyielding environment. For the next 2 years, no one in England is particularly worried. The expedition was expected to be a long one, and the lack of news is not, at first, a cause for concern. But as the third year passes, and then the fourth, a profound sense of dread begins to set in. The search for the Franklin expedition becomes the most expensive and extensive search and rescue mission in human history. It is a quiet, desperate, and often futile effort that would last for decades. But what happened to the ships, and to the men who sailed on them? The answer, when it finally emerged, would be a quiet and tragic testament to the power of nature and the fragility of human ambition. The story is a series of small, mundane events that led to a great and lasting mystery. For over a year, the two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, sailed deeper into the Arctic, following a path that was known to be navigable at certain times of the year. The weather was a mix of mild summers and frigid winters. In September 1846, the ships became trapped in the thick, multi-year ice of the Victoria Strait, just off the coast of King William Island. This was not an unusual event for Arctic exploration. Ships were often frozen in the ice for a winter, waiting for the spring thaw to free them. But for Franklin's expedition, this would be a permanent prison. The next 2 winters were spent in the ice. The crew, at first, was well provisioned and confident. They spent their time in the same boring ways that all sailors do on a long journey, playing games, reading books, and carrying out the daily routines of ship life. But as the months turned into years, and the ice refused to break, a slow, quiet dread must have settled over the men. Their food stores, though vast, were not infinite. The preserved meat and vegetables, which were meant to last for 3 years, were beginning to show their age. The tins were soldered with lead, and a slow, insidious form of lead poisoning began to afflict the crew. The symptoms were subtle at first: headaches, joint pain, and a profound sense of fatigue. It was a slow-motion catastrophe, a silent and boring poison that was a direct result of the new industrial technology they relied on. By April 1848, the situation was dire. Sir John Franklin had died in June 1847, a death likely hastened by the lead poisoning. The ships were still trapped, and the crew, now led by Captain Francis Crozier, made a momentous and desperate decision. They decided to abandon the ships and march south, to the mouth of the Back River on the Canadian mainland, where they believed they could find food and help from the local Inuit people. It was a bold and, as it turned out, fatal decision. On April 22, 1848, 105 men left the ships, dragging heavy lifeboats full of supplies and equipment. The march was a slow and agonizing process. The men, weakened by scurvy and lead poisoning, were not in a fit state for such a journey. They were poorly dressed for the harsh conditions, and the supplies they dragged with them, including heavy silver cutlery and dinner plates, were a testament to their profound psychological unreadiness for the raw reality of survival. The boring details of their struggle, the constant hunger, the gnawing cold, the slow, relentless trudge through the snow, were a quiet and tragic end to a grand and ambitious mission. The search for the expedition, which had begun in 1848, became an international obsession. Dozens of ships were sent to the Arctic, some of them spending years in the ice. The searches were a monument to human determination, but they were largely futile. The Arctic, with its vast and unforgiving landscape, was a silent accomplice to the tragedy. It swallowed up the ships and their crew, leaving behind only the faintest of clues. The few bodies that were found and later exhumed were a grim testament to their suffering. But the fate of the ships themselves remained a mystery for over 150 years. What happened to the vessels, the ironclad symbols of imperial ambition, and what final secrets did they hold? The search for the Franklin expedition continued for decades, a quiet and desperate campaign that captured the public's imagination. Over 30 expeditions were launched, a testament to the nation's grief and its refusal to give up. The search parties, many of them led by seasoned Arctic explorers, found a series of grim and telling clues. They found a few scattered remains, some of which were later identified through DNA analysis. They found campsites and equipment, and the most crucial discovery of all, a small note, left in a cairn on King William Island. The note, dated April 25, 1848, stated that the ships had been trapped in the ice for 2 years and that 24 men, including Sir John Franklin, had died. It was a brief, heartbreaking summary of a long and tragic ordeal. The note also revealed the men had abandoned the ships and were marching south. The note confirmed their fate, but the mystery of the ships themselves remained. The oral history of the local Inuit people, who had witnessed the slow, agonizing end of the expedition, was largely ignored by the British searchers, who dismissed it as unreliable folklore. The Inuit spoke of a ship that had been trapped in the ice and of another that had been found near a small island. These quiet, unheeded testimonies were the missing pieces of the puzzle. The final chapter in the Franklin mystery was a long, painstaking scientific and archaeological investigation that began in the 21st century. The search for the ships was not a dramatic, swashbuckling adventure but a methodical, high-tech hunt. The modern search teams used sonar and other advanced mapping technologies to scour the seabed. They were guided by the quiet, overlooked clues in the Inuit oral histories and the few written records left by the expedition. In 2014, after years of searching, a Canadian expedition discovered the wreck of HMS Erebus in the chilly waters of the Queen Maud Gulf. The ship, remarkably well preserved by the cold water, was found almost exactly where the Inuit had said it would be. The discovery was a quiet triumph of modern archaeology and a vindication of the indigenous knowledge that had been ignored for so long. The discovery of HMS Terror followed in 2016, a few miles away. The ship, also in an excellent state of preservation, was a haunting and poignant time capsule of the expedition's final days. The interior of the ship was largely intact, and a small, quiet robot was sent inside to capture the first images of a world frozen in time. The story of the Franklin expedition is a boring history in its final, quiet conclusion. It is a story of a great tragedy that was not solved with a dramatic act of heroism, but with the slow, meticulous work of scientists, archaeologists, and historians. It is a testament to the power of human resilience, not just of the men who tried to survive, but of the people who refused to let their story be forgotten. The expedition was a product of its time, a time of imperial confidence and scientific arrogance. Its failure was a humbling reminder that nature, in its vast and silent power, is always the final victor. The story of the Franklin expedition is a quiet, tragic tale that reminds us that some of history's greatest dramas are not fought with swords, but against a cold and indifferent world. You are drifting now, the cold silence of the Arctic giving way to the oppressive heat and humidity of a dense jungle. We are in Panama, in the year 1881. This is a quiet, unassuming place, a narrow strip of land that connects two vast continents. For centuries, this little isthmus has been a tantalizing geographical riddle, a bottleneck for global trade, and a source of frustrated ambition. The idea of a canal, a man-made waterway to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, has been a dream for explorers and merchants for centuries. It would revolutionize global trade, shorten voyages by thousands of miles, and solidify the power of the nation that could build it. The man who took on this monumental task was Ferdinand de Lesseps, a French diplomat and engineer. He was a living legend, a man who had successfully overseen the construction of the Suez Canal, an equally ambitious project that had connected the Mediterranean and Red Seas. The Suez Canal was a triumph of engineering and a testament to de Lesseps's vision and tenacity. He was seen as a hero, a man who could command nature itself. He was confident, charismatic, and had a knack for raising immense sums of money from investors. He believed the Panama Canal would be a far simpler project than the Suez, which was built through a flat desert. Panama, with its tropical forests and its close proximity to sea level, seemed to him an ideal location. The French project began with great fanfare and immense financial backing. It was a private enterprise, funded by the sale of shares to the French public. It was a boring history because its success, and later its failure, was not determined by grand battles or political intrigue, but by the relentless, quiet work of thousands of laborers. The plan was to build a sea-level canal, a simple, straight cut through the isthmus. It was a plan based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the landscape. Panama was not a flat desert. It was a land of steep mountains, dense rainforests, and two distinct seasons, a long, dry season and an equally long, torrential rainy season. The French engineers and their investors were focused on the grand vision. They were confident they could overcome the physical challenges. They did not, however, account for the unseen enemies, the microscopic forces of nature that would quietly and methodically destroy the project from within. These enemies were the mosquitoes, which carried diseases like malaria and yellow fever, and the mud, which became a soupy, impassable obstacle during the rainy season. These were not challenges that could be overcome with grand pronouncements or heroic effort. They were a slow, grinding reality that would quietly and insidiously undermine the entire project. The French, with all their money and all their engineering genius, were about to learn a profound and costly lesson. What would happen when the power of human ambition met the quiet, relentless power of nature? The French effort to build the Panama Canal was, at its core, a clash between ambition and reality. While the engineers and laborers toiled relentlessly, the project was quietly being undermined by two invisible forces. The first was the relentless tropical weather. The rainy season in Panama, which lasts for over half the year, turned the ground into a treacherous, impassable quagmire. The enormous excavation pits, dug with the latest steam-powered shovels, would fill with water and mud, undoing months of work in a matter of days. The jungle, with its fast-growing vegetation, would reclaim the cleared land almost as quickly as it was cut down. The logistical challenge of moving men and equipment through the mud and over the difficult terrain was immense. But the most insidious enemy was disease. The French engineers and their thousands of laborers, many of them from the West Indies, were dying at an alarming rate. They were contracting diseases with terrifying names, malaria and yellow fever. The medical community of the time had no understanding of how these diseases were transmitted. The prevailing theory was that they were caused by bad air or miasma from the swamps in the jungle. The French built lavish hospitals and provided excellent care, but they did nothing to address the root cause of the problem. They put the legs of the hospital beds in pans of water to keep the ants away, inadvertently creating perfect breeding grounds for the mosquitoes that carried the deadly viruses. The sick were dying in clean beds, unaware that their very environment was killing them. The death toll was staggering. The French project saw the deaths of an estimated 22,000 workers. The vast majority of these deaths were not from accidents or injuries but from disease. The quiet, relentless attrition of life was a more effective force than any physical obstacle. The project became a monument to human sacrifice, a silent graveyard in the heart of the jungle. The human cost was simply too high. As the years passed, the financial and human costs mounted. The company, which had started with a massive investment from the French public, was hemorrhaging money. The Grand Sea Level plan was proving to be a physical and financial impossibility. De Lesseps, a man of profound optimism and ambition, refused to give up. He finally agreed to a lock canal plan, similar to the one that would later be built by the Americans. But by this time, it was too late. The company was on the brink of financial collapse. In 1889, the French Panama Canal Company went bankrupt. The scandal that followed was immense, a major event in French politics known as the Panama Scandal. It ruined the careers of countless politicians and investors, and it left the French public, many of whom were small-time investors, in a state of financial ruin and profound disillusionment. The project had failed, not because of a lack of skill or courage, but because of a fundamental ignorance of a key scientific principle. The French had the money, the ambition, and the engineering knowledge, but they did not have the one thing that mattered most, an understanding of the tiny, silent, and deadly enemy that was hiding in the shadows. The quiet failure of the French project was a profound and lasting lesson in the limits of human hubris. What would it take for another nation to learn from the mistakes of the French and succeed where they had so tragically failed? The lessons of the French failure in Panama were not learned quickly or easily. It would take a new nation, with new technologies and a new scientific understanding, to finally succeed. That nation was the United States, and its leader was President Theodore Roosevelt. The American effort to build the canal, which began in 1904, was a direct and deliberate reaction to the French experience. The Americans did not begin by digging. They began by cleaning. The chief medical officer for the American project was Dr. William C. Gorgas, a man who had successfully applied a new theory of disease prevention in Cuba. He had a profound understanding of the work of Dr. Carlos Finley and Walter Reed, who had proven that yellow fever and malaria were transmitted by mosquitoes. Gorgas did not subscribe to the miasma theory. He knew that the enemy was not bad air but a tiny insect. He embarked on a massive, almost fanatical, public health campaign. His team drained swamps, fumigated homes, installed screens on windows, and spread oil on stagnant water to prevent mosquito larvae from hatching. It was a boring, tedious, and meticulous process, but it was the key to the project's success. The health of the workers improved dramatically, and the death rate plummeted. It was a quiet, almost unseen victory, a triumph of science and public health that made the grand engineering feat possible. The engineering of the American Canal was also a departure from the French project. The American chief engineer, John F. Stevens, abandoned the idea of a sea-level canal and proposed a more practical lock canal system, a series of enormous locks that would lift ships over the mountains and then lower them down to the other side. His plan was a masterpiece of civil engineering, a triumph of practicality over the grand, but ultimately impossible, vision of the French. The construction was still a monumental undertaking, but it was approached with a new level of organization and industrial efficiency. The scale of the excavation was immense, with millions of cubic yards of earth moved by a fleet of steam shovels and a massive railway system. The Panama Canal, when it was finally completed in 1914, was a triumph of engineering, but its true legacy is a boring history of public health and logistics. It was not a victory won with grand speeches or political bravado, but with the quiet, painstaking work of thousands of laborers, engineers, and doctors. The canal is a monument to a simple idea, that a grand project cannot succeed if the health and safety of the people who build it are not a top priority. The story of the French failure and the American success is a powerful lesson in the limitations of ambition and the necessity of learning from past mistakes. The canal, which has revolutionized global trade, stands as a testament to the fact that the most significant events in history are often the result of a quiet, methodical, and even boring dedication to details that everyone else has overlooked. You are drifting back in time, over 1,000 years, to a world of emperors and legions, of marble forums and vast, sprawling empires. The year is 305 AD, and we are in the Roman Empire. But this is not the Rome of Caesar and Augustus, a unified and all-powerful state. This is a Rome in a state of quiet crisis. For over a century, the empire has been in a period of turmoil known as the crisis of the 3rd century, a time of civil wars, economic collapse, and foreign invasions. The great Roman state, which once seemed eternal, is on the brink of implosion. The man who has, for all intents and purposes, saved the empire is Emperor Diocletian. He is not a charismatic military hero in the mold of Caesar. He is, first and foremost, a bureaucrat and an administrator. His genius lies not in his battlefield victories, but in his ability to recognize that the empire is simply too large for one man to govern. His solution is a radical and unprecedented one, the tetrarchy, or rule of 4. He divides the empire into 2 halves, a western and an eastern, and appoints a co-emperor, an Augustus, to rule the other half. He then appoints a junior emperor, a Caesar, to assist each Augustus and to eventually succeed him. This creates a system of quiet, predictable succession that is meant to prevent the endless civil wars that have plagued the empire. Diocletian's reign is a triumph of boring history. It is a story of administrative reform, economic regulation, and a meticulous, unglamorous effort to stabilize a failing state. He introduces a new system of taxation, a new set of prices and wages, and a new way of organizing the military. He moves the imperial capital away from Rome, to a series of more strategically located cities on the empire's borders. His chosen residence is a modest palace in Nicomedia in the east. He is not a man who lives in the grand tradition of Roman emperors, he lives and works like a chief executive. He is a workhorse, not a showman. For over 20 years, this system works. The empire is stable, the borders are secure, and the economy, though still struggling, is no longer in a state of freefall. But for the Tetrarchy to work, there is one final, crucial piece of the puzzle: the emperors must be willing to step down. The very foundation of the system is the idea that power is not a possession to be held until death, but a responsibility to be passed on. This is a revolutionary idea in a Roman world where emperors ruled until their last breath. On this quiet day in 305 AD, Diocletian is about to do something no Roman emperor has ever done before. He is about to give up his power willingly. It is a quiet, unassuming act that will have a profound and lasting impact on the Roman Empire and the history of power itself. What was the purpose of this unprecedented act, and what would happen to the carefully constructed system when its founder, the man who held it all together, decided to walk away? On May 1, 305 AD, in a field just outside the city of Nicomedia, Emperor Diocletian stood before his court, his legions, and his co-emperor, Galerius. The air was thick with anticipation. Diocletian, a man who had reigned for 2 decades, was about to do something that was completely foreign to the Roman world. He announced that he was resigning his position as Augustus of the East. His co-emperor in the West, Maximian, was also forced to resign on the same day in a coordinated, if reluctant, move. The 2 junior emperors, the Caesars, were elevated to the rank of Augustus, and 2 new Caesars were appointed. The succession had worked. Power had been transferred peacefully and predictably, without a single battle or assassination. It was a triumph of bureaucracy over the chaos of civil war. The act of resignation was a quiet, almost understated affair. There were no great speeches, no declarations of a new era, just the simple, unglamorous transfer of power. Diocletian, having accomplished his great work, simply walked away. He retired to his enormous palace on the coast of the Adriatic Sea, in what is now split, Croatia. His life in retirement was a study in quiet, almost mundane, simplicity. He spent his days tending to his vegetable garden, a symbolic return to a more basic, agrarian life. The man who had ruled the most powerful empire in the world was now a private citizen, a farmer in his own right. When his co-emperor Maximian, who had begrudgingly resigned, tried to convince him to return to power, Diocletian famously replied, "If you could see the cabbages planted by my own hands at Salona, you would certainly never think of urging me to substitute for the peaceful happiness of this place the storms of a never-satisfied greed." It was a profound statement, a quiet refutation of the very idea of power for power's sake. The act of his retirement was a public testament to the principles of his own system. It was a show of faith in the Tetrarchy, a demonstration that the system was bigger than the man who created it. But history, as always, had other plans. The carefully constructed system of succession did not last. The new emperors, less committed to the idea of shared rule, began to jockey for power. The old rivalries and ambitions that Diocletian had so carefully suppressed began to resurface. The quiet resignation of one man, no matter how profound, could not hold back the tide of human greed and ambition forever. The system of the Tetrarchy, which had worked for 2 decades, began to unravel almost as soon as Diocletian left. A new wave of civil wars began, a quiet, insidious return to the chaos that had defined the Roman Empire for so long. The man who had so brilliantly fixed the empire's greatest problem had, in a sense, simply postponed the inevitable. His retirement was a quiet, bureaucratic masterpiece, but it was also a historical anomaly, an event that was too logical, too rational, for the messy reality of human politics. The quiet, unglamorous end of Diocletian's reign is a boring history because its significance lies not in a great battle but in a simple act of resignation. It is a story that proves that even the most brilliant of political systems are only as strong as the people who believe in them. The man who saved the empire was also, in his own way, a prophet of its slow, bureaucratic decline. The question that remains is, why did his brilliant system fail, and what did his quiet act of resignation really mean for the future of the Roman Empire? You are drifting now, the grand halls of the Roman Empire and the quiet contemplation of a retired emperor fading into the dust of time. We are in a different world now, a world of steam engines and telegraphs, of industrial ambition and profound political division. The year is 1861, and we are in the United States. The nation is on the brink of a brutal and bloody conflict, the American Civil War. The story of this war is most often told through the great battles, Gettysburg, Antietam, Vicksburg. But the real, boring story of the war is not found on the battlefield. It is found in the supply depots, on the railroads, and in the quiet, methodical work of the men who kept the armies fed, clothed, and armed. This is a story of logistics, a word that is as unglamorous as it is essential. For the first time in history, two massive, modern armies would be fighting a war of attrition on an industrial scale. The soldiers, whether they were marching through the mud of Virginia or the red clay of Georgia, were not self-sufficient. They were entirely dependent on a vast, unseen network of supply and demand. The Union Army, with its far superior industrial base, had a clear advantage. The North had a massive network of railroads, factories, and a seemingly endless supply of raw materials. The Confederate Army, meanwhile, was a largely agrarian society, with a far smaller and less developed industrial base. This was not a war that would be won by heroism alone. It would be won, or lost, by the quiet, unglamorous work of railroad engineers, quartermasters, and supply clerks. The main protagonist of this boring history is a man named Montgomery C. Meigs, the Quartermaster General of the Union Army. He is not a charismatic field commander, but a brilliant, meticulous engineer. His job is to manage the flow of supplies, from the factories of the North to the far-flung battlefields of the South. His is a story of charts and ledgers, of contracts and transportation schedules. It is a story of making sure that a pair of boots, a rifle, and a pound of coffee get from a factory in Massachusetts to a soldier in Tennessee. His job is to make the boring, routine work of an army, the daily need for food, clothes, and ammunition, an efficient and reliable system. The sheer scale of the logistical challenge was unprecedented. The Union Army, at its peak, would number over 1 million men. That is 1 million men who needed to be fed 3 times a day, 1 million men who needed uniforms, and 1 million men who needed rifles and ammunition. This was a logistical nightmare, a problem that could not be solved by brute force. It required a new kind of thinking, a new kind of war. And at its heart, it was a battle between the industrial North and the agrarian South, a war of numbers, not just of men, but of rails, factories, and the quiet, unglamorous work of supply and demand. What would happen when a war of great ideals was decided not on the battlefield, but in the back offices of a railroad company? The American Civil War was a proving ground for the new industrial age, and the logistics of supplying the Union Army were a testament to this fact. At the head of this monumental task was Quartermaster General Montgomery C. Meigs. A trained engineer, Meigs approached the war not as a romantic military campaign but as a vast, complex logistical problem to be solved. His first great challenge was simply providing uniforms and boots for an army that would grow to over 1 million men. The Union's existing supply system was archaic and designed for a small, pre-industrial army. Meigs had to build a new one from scratch. He contracted with thousands of private companies, organized a massive system of procurement, and established new supply depots and arsenals. The real boring work was done on the railroads. For the first time, a major war would be fought and won on rails. The Union had a vast network of railroads, and Meigs's office was responsible for managing them. They had to ensure that trains carrying everything from rifles and ammunition to blankets and coffee arrived at the front lines on time. The Confederate Army, in contrast, had a smaller, less interconnected rail system. The Union's logistical superiority was a quiet but decisive advantage. The Northern soldiers, for the most part, were well-fed, well-clothed, and well-armed. The Southern soldiers, particularly in the later years of the war, were often hungry, poorly clothed, and desperately short on ammunition. This was not a failure of courage or will, it was a failure of logistics. The quiet, methodical work of Meigs and his team was not always appreciated. Field commanders often complained about the slow pace of supply, but they did not see the immense scale of the problem. A single Union Army corps, consisting of tens of thousands of men, consumed an astronomical amount of supplies. 1 million men on the march needed millions of pounds of food every day. They needed new shoes every few months, and they needed a constant supply of ammunition for their rifles and cannons. Meigs's office was a logistical machine, a silent partner in every major Union victory. The most famous example of this logistical superiority was General William Tecumseh Sherman's march to the sea. While Sherman's march is often seen as a bold act of military genius, its success was only possible because of the logistical infrastructure that supported it. Sherman cut his army loose from its supply lines, but he knew that his army was living off the land, consuming the agricultural wealth of the South. His was a war of logistics as much as it was a war of maneuver. When he reached the sea, his army was resupplied by a waiting fleet of Union ships, a testament to the North's absolute mastery of supply. The American Civil War's boring history is a testament to the power of organization and industrial capacity. The North's victory was not just a triumph of its soldiers and generals, it was a triumph of its railroads, its factories, and its quartermasters. The war was a brutal and bloody conflict, but its outcome was decided in the quiet, unglamorous work of spreadsheets and supply chains. The victory was not won by a single, heroic act, but by a million small, mundane acts of efficiency and planning. The quiet, methodical work of men like Montgomery Meigs was the true engine of the Union victory. What lessons would the world learn from a war that was won not by the sword, but by the supply line?